The bullet meant for the most feared man in Boston tore, instead, through the ribs of the woman everyone had spent the entire evening laughing at. It happened in the space of a single breath. One moment she was being escorted toward the service exit of the Ashcroft Hotel, with champagne staining the front of her cream uniform and blood dripping from her sliced palm. The next moment she was airborne, throwing 235 pounds of her body against the shoulder of a man in a midnight black brioni tuxedo, and the crack of a suppressed pistol was echoing off the marble columns of the grand ballroom. She hit the floor with him on top of her. Something hot and wrong bloomed beneath her ribs. She heard screaming that seemed very far away, and then she heard his voice, low and furious and afraid, pressed against her ear like a prayer. "Stay with me. Look at me. What is your name?" "Della," she whispered. "Della. Stay." "That is an order." Then the world went dark. 3 days later, she opened her eyes in a hospital suite that smelled of white peonies and expensive antiseptic, and there was a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond weighing down her left hand. She had saved his life on instinct. She had no idea he had already decided she would never leave his side again. The Ashcroft Hotel had stood on Beacon Hill for 112 years, and in that time it had hosted 3 sitting presidents for royal weddings and enough quiet murders to fill a small graveyard. On the last Saturday of October, its grand ballroom was dressed for the annual Boston Charitable Foundation Gala, and the air inside smelled of aged bourbon, gardenias, and the faint, sharp scent of gun oil hidden under 200 bottles of French cologne. Hand-cut crystal chandeliers threw slow, golden light across a sea of brioni tuxedos and Oscar de la Renta gowns. A string quartet played Debussy from a raised platform draped in ivory silk. Waiters glided between tables, carrying trays of 1982 Chateau Latour poured into glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Outside the tall, arched windows, a cold October rain slid down the cobblestones of Beacon Street, and the harbor beyond glittered black under the storm. It was the kind of room where old money went to be seen and new money went to be tolerated, and the men who owned the shadows of the city went to remind everyone else exactly whose city it was. Every powerful family in New England was under one roof that night. The Morettis, the Sullivans, the Whitlocks, the old Brahmin dynasties. And beneath the music and the laughter and the clink of crystal, there ran an 8-month-old Cold War that everyone in the room could feel in their teeth. Delphine Marchetti had been on her feet for 11 hours. At 29 years old, she stood 5'6" and carried 235 pounds on a broad-shouldered frame that no one in the Ashcroft's corporate office had ever bothered to order a properly fitted uniform for. The cream-serving jacket she wore was pulled tight across her back, and the buttons at the front strained every time she reached across a table. Her dark hair was pinned in a low, practical bun. She wore no makeup. Her feet ached inside orthopedic non-slip shoes, and her lower back had been a dull, screaming knot since noon. She was the catering floor supervisor for Ashcroft Hospitality, and she was the reason the evening was running with the frictionless elegance the guests would credit to the hotel's reputation. She had memorized every dietary restriction on the 200-person guest list. She had rerouted a broken warming cart 40 minutes before service, without a single guest noticing. She had personally intercepted a nervous new busser about to serve shellfish to a woman with a lethal allergy. No one had thanked her. No one ever did. To the guests she was invisible, and to her manager she was a problem to be managed. Marcus Vance was watching her from across the ballroom right now, and his expression suggested he had already decided she would not be coming back on Monday. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was who Della Marchetti had been before she became invisible. Her father, Detective Michael Marchetti, had been a Boston Police Department homicide investigator, and he had raised her on his lap with case files spread across the kitchen table. When he was killed in what the official record called a random gang shooting, she was 16 years old, and something in her had gone quiet and hard and observant in a way that never fully softened again. Her mother had remarried 2 years later, and her stepfather was a former Delta Force combat medic named Ray Coleman, who did not know how to talk to a grieving teenage girl except by teaching her the things he knew. So from 16 to 22, Della had learned how to read a room the way her father had, and how to keep someone alive with her bare hands the way Ray had. She had passed every entrance exam for the FBI Academy at Quantico. She had made it 11 weeks in before her mother's early-onset Alzheimer's diagnosis pulled her home for good. 7 years later, she was $94,000 in debt to a memory care facility in Brookline, and she was carrying trays of champagne for people who looked through her like she was made of smoke. But her eyes still worked the way her father had trained them. And tonight, her eyes had already noticed 3 things about the Ashcroft ballroom that no one else in the room had seen. At the head table sat Rafael Moretti, and every server in the ballroom had been warned not to look directly at him. He was 36 years old, 6'3", broad through the shoulders in a way that his tailored jacket could not quite disguise. His dark hair was silvering at the temples, and his jaw looked as though it had been cut from Carrara marble by a sculptor who had run out of patience for softness. He wore no jewelry except a single onyx signet ring on his right hand. His eyes were a pale, almost colorless green, the shade of harbor ice in February, and they moved through the room with the slow, unbothered stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry. He was the head of the Moretti family, and he controlled the North End, the ports of South Boston, half the construction unions in New England, and a great many other things that the Boston Globe was not permitted to write about. Whispered stories followed him like cologne. A rival capo who had vanished after insulting Rafe's late mother. A federal prosecutor whose case files had spontaneously caught fire. 3 assassination attempts survived in the past 2 years alone. He had come to the gala tonight because appearances mattered, and because his absence would have been read as fear. He was seated between his consigliere, a silver-haired old man named Tommaso, and an empty chair that had been reserved for a date he had not brought. Della was refilling water glasses at the head table when Rafael Moretti spoke to her for the first time. He did not look up. He simply said in the polite, textbook Italian a man might use when he assumed the woman beside him did not speak a word of it, that he would prefer the 2010 Barolo to whatever indignity the sommelier had just poured into his glass. It was the kind of instruction meant to be handled by staff without acknowledgement. Della finished pouring his water. Then she leaned down just slightly, just enough that only he could hear her, and answered him in the flawless northern Italian her stepfather's mother had taught her across a decade of Sunday dinners. She told him, with quiet respect, that the 2010 Barolo was corked, that the sommelier had already discreetly pulled the bottle, and that the 2008 was drinking beautifully tonight, if he would allow her to bring one to the table. For the first time all evening, Rafael Moretti's pale green eyes lifted. He looked at her, actually looked. He took in the too-tight uniform and the exhaustion under her eyes, and the way she held herself with the straight-backed calm of someone who had learned to be still under fire. He said only in English, "Thank you." But something behind those cold eyes had shifted, and he would remember that moment for the rest of his life. He simply did not know it yet. The humiliation came less than 20 minutes later, and it came from Cassandra Whitlock-Sullivan. She was 32 years old, blonde, size 0, wrapped in a $40,000 Oscar de la Renta gown the color of oxblood, and she was engaged to Declan Sullivan, the eldest son of the family that had been quietly trying to put a bullet in Rafael Moretti for 8 months. She was drunk. She was also bored, and cruelty had always been how Cassandra entertained herself when a room stopped paying her enough attention. She watched Della cross the floor with a full tray of champagne flutes balanced on one broad shoulder, and she waited until the exact moment when Della was passing her chair. Then she moved her foot. It was elegant, practiced, invisible to anyone not watching for it. Della's ankle caught. The tray tipped. 12 crystal flutes hit the marble in a single bright, shattering cascade, and a wave of Dom Perignon splashed across the front of Cassandra's oxblood gown. The ballroom went silent. The string quartet faltered. 200 faces turned. And Cassandra, with the timing of a woman who had rehearsed this in her head 100 times, threw back her head and laughed. And then she looked around the room and delivered her line loud enough for the back tables to hear. "My God," she said, "they really will hire anything with a pulse these days. Sweetheart, when the whale beaches itself, someone is supposed to push it back into the ocean. not put it in a uniform. The laughter that followed was not universal. But it was enough. It was more than enough. Della did not cry. She did not answer. She knelt on the marble in front of 200 of Boston's wealthiest people and began to pick up the broken glass with her bare hands. And when a shard sliced deep into the meat of her palm and her blood began to mix with the champagne on the floor, she did not even flinch. Marcus Vance was on her within seconds, hissing furious apologies to Cassandra and hissing furious threats at Della under his breath. "Get off the floor," he whispered. "Get up. You are done here tonight. You are probably done here tomorrow. Do not embarrass this hotel any further than you already have." Della stood. Her palm was bleeding down her wrist. The front of her uniform was soaked. Her back was screaming. And somewhere very deep inside her chest, in the place her father used to call the still room, something small and old and iron-hard had gone very quiet and very awake. From across the ballroom, Rafael Moretti had watched the entire thing. He had not moved. He had not intervened. He had simply set down his wine glass with a soft, precise click, and his pale green eyes had settled on Cassandra Whitlock-Sullivan with the flat, patient attention of a man taking inventory of a debt. Cassandra Whitlock had just insulted the wrong woman in front of the wrong man. She would not survive the month with her reputation intact. But before any of that could happen, 3 men in the ballroom were about to try to kill Rafael Moretti, and the only person in the room who had noticed them was the woman bleeding on the floor. Marcus had her by the elbow, marching her toward the service exit at the back of the ballroom, and Della's eyes were doing what her father had trained them to do since she was 10 years old. They were not looking at the floor. They were not looking at Marcus. They were reading the room. A waiter near the west columns was adjusting his cuff with his left hand, and the motion had pulled his jacket back just enough to reveal the black rubber grip of a suppressed pistol tucked into a shoulder holster no server at the Ashcroft was supposed to be wearing. She kept walking. Her eyes moved. A second man near the balcony doors was standing too still, and his hands were empty in a way that professional hands were empty when they were waiting to be full. A third man by the kitchen entrance had his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, and he was watching not the room, but the head table, and the geometry of the 3 of them together drew a triangle whose exact center was Rafael Moretti's chair. 3-point ambush. Professional. Cold, disciplined, expensive work. Della felt the still room in her chest go very quiet, and she felt her father standing behind her the way she sometimes still did when she was afraid. She had a choice. She could keep walking. She could step through the service door with Marcus, take off her ruined uniform, wash her bleeding hand, and go home to her tiny apartment in Dorchester and never think about any of these people again. No one in this room had ever shown her a single kindness. She owed them nothing. She owed him nothing. But her father had raised a woman who ran toward the sound of gunfire, not away from it. She yanked her elbow out of Marcus Vance's grip, and then Della Marchetti, in a stained cream uniform with blood dripping from her hand, did something no one in the Ashcroft Grand Ballroom had ever seen a woman of her size do. She ran. She ran the way Ray had taught her, weight forward, shoulders low, moving through the tables in a straight line that ignored every rule of etiquette the room had ever known. Guests turned. Somewhere behind her, Cassandra Whitlock let out a delighted, cutting laugh, thinking the fat waitress was fleeing the ballroom in humiliation. She could not have been more wrong. Della saw the first shooter's arm come up. She saw the barrel clear his jacket. She saw the exact angle of his shoulder, and she knew, with the cold arithmetic her father had drilled into her since she was a child, where the bullet was going to go. She hit Rafael Moretti in the chest with the full driving force of her body, 235 pounds of trained, terrified, furious woman, and she drove him sideways out of his chair a fraction of a second before the suppressed, round cracked through the ballroom. Something punched her under the ribs on her left side. It did not hurt yet. It only felt hot and wrong and very deep. She hit the marble with him on top of her. She heard the second shot, and the third, and then she heard Rafe's voice very close, giving orders she could not quite make out. She saw the ceiling. She saw the chandeliers spinning slowly above her, gold and impossible. And then she saw his face above hers, and his hand was pressed hard against her side, and there was blood on his white shirt cuff that was not his own. His eyes were no longer the color of harbor ice. They were burning. "Stay with me," he said. His voice cracked around the edges in a way no one in Boston had ever heard it crack. "Look at me. What is your name?" "Della," she whispered. "Della. Stay. That is an order." Somewhere in the ballroom, someone was still screaming. And before her eyes closed, she saw Cassandra Whitlock-Sullivan standing frozen at her table with her mouth open and champagne dripping down her gown. And Della thought, with a last clear thought she would have for 3 days, that the woman who had just called her a whale was about to learn exactly what a whale could do when it decided to move. If your heart is pounding right now, do this before you go any further. Hit that like button, because it tells the algorithm to show the story to more women who need to be reminded that being underestimated is not the same as being weak. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because part 2 of Della's story is where everything you think you understand about Rafael Moretti gets turned inside out, and you do not want to miss what she wakes up to. Now stay with me, because the ring on her finger is only the beginning. She came back to the world in pieces. First there was the smell. White peonies, thick and clean and faintly sweet, cutting through the sharper undertone of antiseptic and starched linen. Then there was the light, soft and gold, and filtered through heavy curtains she did not recognize. Then there was the weight on her left hand, cold and impossible and much too heavy for a hand that had been empty for 29 years. Della opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was coffered mahogany, not the water-stained drop tile of Massachusetts General, where a woman, with her insurance, would have been placed. The bed beneath her was a hospital bed, but it had been dressed in cream Egyptian cotton, and someone had put her in silk pajamas the color of dove feathers that she had absolutely not been wearing when she lost consciousness on the marble floor of the Ashcroft Grand Ballroom. A morphine drip ran into her right arm. A neat white bandage wrapped her ribs beneath the silk, and on her left ring finger, catching the golden light and throwing it back in slow, terrible fire, sat a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond flanked by 2 smaller stones, set in a platinum band that looked old enough to have been worn by a woman who had died before Della was born. She stared at it. She could not make her mind close around it. Somewhere to her left, a chair creaked, and a voice she remembered from the edge of unconsciousness said quietly, "You are awake." Rafael Moretti was sitting 3 feet from her bed, and he did not look like the man from the ballroom. He was in a black cashmere sweater and dark jeans, and he had 3 days of stubble along the marble jaw, and the pale green eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had not left the chair in a very long time. There was a folder on his lap. There was a coffee cup on the side table that had gone cold, and on the bedside table beside her, in a neat stack, sat every unpaid invoice from the Brookline Meadows Memory Care Facility, $94,000 of debt that had been strangling her for 3 years, and every single one of them had been stamped in red ink across the front, paid in full. Della's eyes moved from the invoices to the ring to his face. Her throat was dry. When she tried to speak the first time, nothing came out. When she tried the second time, her voice was a rasp. "Why is there a ring on my finger?" she said. Rafe did not move. "Because you are alive," he said. "That is not an answer," she said. "It is the only one that matters to me," he said. And then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and his voice dropped into a register no one in Boston had ever heard him use. "You were on the operating table for 6 hours, Della. The round went through the intercostal muscle, nicked the edge of your spleen, and lodged against your 7th rib. You lost 2 liters of blood. You died on the table for 41 seconds. I was in the corridor for all of it. Now, ask me again about the ring, but be certain you want the answer." She looked at him. She looked at the ring. She said, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, "Tell me." He told her. He told her that in his family, in the old country, in the traditions his grandfather had brought over from Palermo in 1948, when a woman placed her body between the head of a house and death, there was only one response the family was permitted to make. She was no longer a stranger. She was no longer staff. She was no longer someone the family could allow the world to touch. She came under the absolute protection of the Moretti name for the rest of her natural life, and there was, in the tradition, only one legal instrument that carried that weight. The ring on her finger had belonged to his grandmother, Serafina Moretti, and it had not been worn by any woman since Serafina had been buried in 1984. Rafe had taken it from the safe in his study at 4 in the morning on the night of the shooting, while Della was still bleeding on the operating table, and he had brought it to the hospital in his pocket, and he had put it on her finger himself while she was still unconscious, because the alternative, in the world he lived in, was leaving her exposed. "She saved my life," he said. "In the world I was raised in. That means she is mine to protect until the day I die. The ring is a declaration to every family from here to Sicily. It is not a cage, Della. You are not obligated to accept anything. But it stays on your finger until you decide, and until you decide, no one in this city, this country, or this hemisphere will ever be allowed to touch you again." She stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated behind the bandage. "And you did not think," she said slowly, "to ask me first." His mouth moved into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "You were dead for 41 seconds, he said. "I was not in a mood to wait for consent from a woman. I had already decided I was not going to lose twice." Before she could answer him, before she could even begin to sort the storm of things happening under her ribs, the door to the suite opened, and a silver-haired old man in a charcoal three-piece suit stepped inside, carrying a leather folder. Rafe stood. "Della," he said, "this is Tommaso Ricci. He has been my family's consigliere for 38 years. He asked to speak with you the moment you woke. There is something you need to know before you decide anything." Tommaso crossed the room with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who had been carrying secrets for longer than Della had been alive. He sat in the chair Rafe had vacated. He set the folder on the edge of her bed, and then he looked at her with dark, kind, terribly tired eyes, and he said, "Miss Marchetti, I knew your father." Della's breath stopped. Tommaso opened the folder. Inside were case files. Old ones. Xerox pages from Boston Police Department homicide records, dated across a 5-year stretch in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Photographs of her father, younger than she had ever seen him, standing on the steps of a Federal Hill church next to a much younger man she slowly realized was Rafe's father, Salvatore Moretti. Handwritten notes in her father's blocky, careful script. A hospital admission form for a 6-year-old girl named Isabella Moretti, dated 1998, pediatric oncology, Boston Children's Hospital. And a funeral card for the same little girl, dated 22 months later. Rafe's little sister, the one Della had never known existed. "Your father," Tommaso said quietly, "was the one honest police officer this family ever met. He was never on our payroll. He never took $1 from us. But when Salvatore's daughter was diagnosed with leukemia, and the hospital wing that could save her was underfunded and closing, your father made an arrangement with the old Don. He would look the other way on certain operations that harmed no one, and in exchange, the Moretti family would fund the pediatric oncology wing at Boston Children's for the next 20 years. That wing has saved 411 children so far. Miss Moretti was not one of them. She died anyway. But your father kept his end of the arrangement, and this family kept ours, and no one outside of 3 people in this room ever knew about it." Della's eyes were burning. Tommaso turned another page. "This is what you need to understand about the night your father died. The official report said it was a random gang shooting. That was a lie approved at a level of the department that no honest detective could touch. Your father was killed by 2 soldiers working for the Sullivan family because he had refused 3 times to flip on the Morettis in exchange for a promotion and his pension protected. He died protecting an arrangement that was saving children he had never met. The Moretti family has owed the Marchetti family a blood debt for 13 years, Miss Marchetti. We did not know where you were. Your mother remarried and changed her name. And by the time we located her, she was already ill, and you had disappeared into service work under a name we did not recognize. Rafe pulled your fingerprints from the hospital intake form 6 hours ago. That is when we learned who you were. That is when he learned who you were." Della turned her head very slowly on the pillow and looked at Rafael Moretti. He was standing at the window with his back to her, and the line of his shoulders was not the line of a Mafia don. It was the line of a man who had just discovered that the woman who had died on an operating table for him was the daughter of the man who had once tried to save his sister. He did not turn around. He said, without looking at her, "I did not know when I put the ring on your finger. I want you to understand that. I put it on you because you took a bullet meant for my heart, and in my world that is enough, and it would have been enough if your name had been anything at all. I found out who you were 3 hours ago." He turned then. His pale green eyes were not cold. They were something else entirely, something she did not have a word for yet. "Nothing has changed about the ring," he said. "But everything has changed about what happens next. The Sullivan family killed your father 13 years ago. Last night they tried to kill me, and they nearly killed you instead. That is a ledger that has been open for a very long time. I am going to close it, and I am asking you because you have earned the right to be asked whether you want to close it with me." Della lay very still in the hospital bed. She thought about her father. She thought about the still room in her chest. She thought about a little girl named Isabella Moretti who had died in a hospital her father had helped to save. She looked down at the ring on her finger, and it did not feel heavy anymore. She looked back up at Rafael Moretti. "Yes," she said, "close it." The next 6 weeks moved like weather. Della never saw most of it happen. She only saw the reports Tommaso brought her every morning while she recovered in the sunlit suite that Rafe had, it turned out, quietly purchased from Massachusetts General a full year earlier for exactly this kind of use. Cassandra Whitlock-Sullivan was the first to fall, and she fell publicly. A forensic accountant with impeccable credentials and no traceable connection to the Moretti family delivered a package to the offices of the Boston Globe containing 8 years of evidence that Cassandra had been embezzling from 3 of the charities she chaired, to the tune of $2.4 million. The story ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she had been removed from every board she sat on. By Thursday, her engagement to Declan Sullivan had been quietly dissolved, and by Friday she had boarded a private plane to a wellness facility in Arizona from which, socially speaking, she would never return. Marcus Vance showed up at the hospital on a Monday, sweating through a cheap suit, trying to grovel his way back into whatever he thought he could still salvage. 2 of Rafe's men escorted him out through the service entrance without raising their voices. He was told, in a tone so pleasant it was almost gentle, that he would spend the rest of his hospitality career managing a 24-hour diner off Interstate 80 in western Pennsylvania. He was on the road by Wednesday. Declan Sullivan received a federal RICO indictment on a Thursday morning based on evidence that had arrived on the desk of a young and ambitious United States attorney in a plain manila envelope with no return address. And the Sullivan family patriarch, Colm Sullivan, received a single visitor in his study on a rainy Sunday evening. Rafael Moretti went alone. He was inside the house for 11 minutes. No one ever asked what was said. No one ever needed to. Colm Sullivan announced his retirement the following morning, and the Sullivan family's operations in New England were absorbed, quietly and without a single additional shot fired, by 3 families who, all coincidentally, owed Rafael Moretti a favor. If you are still with me, if your chest is tight and your hands are cold and you need to know how this ends, do me one favor before I finish. Share this story. Send it to the woman in your life who has spent too many years believing she was too much or not enough, or invisible in rooms that did not deserve her. She needs to hear the end of this. Now, let me tell you what happened to Della. 6 months later, on a cold, clear afternoon in April, Della Marchetti stood on the stone terrace of the Moretti estate on the North Shore, wrapped in a heavy emerald wool coat that had been made for her by a tailor in the North End who had measured every inch of her body with the reverence of a man handling something rare. The Atlantic moved below the cliffs in slow gray swells. Her hair had grown out. Her ribs no longer ached when she breathed deeply. Her mother had been moved to a private suite at the finest memory care facility in Massachusetts, with a permanent placement paid in perpetuity, and Della visited her 3 times a week and read to her from the mystery novels her father had loved. She had used the trust Rafe had opened in her name to establish the Michael Marchetti Scholarship at the Boston Police Academy, funding for cadets a year through their full training in her father's name. She sat at Rafe's right hand during family meetings, and within 4 months, she had quietly taken over the management of the family's philanthropic foundation. And the foundation was, for the first time in a generation, running with the kind of frictionless competence that its board had almost forgotten was possible. The ring was still on her finger. It no longer felt heavy. It felt like it had been made for her hand, which, technically, it now had been. The band had been resized twice. She had stopped noticing it the way she had stopped noticing her own pulse. Rafe stepped out onto the terrace behind her. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "You never gave me an answer, you know." "About what?" she said. "About the ring," he said. "It has been on your finger for 6 months. I put it there while you were unconscious. I never asked whether you wanted it there." She turned. She looked at him. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, invisible and bleeding, and 1 paycheck from eviction, on the floor of a ballroom filled with people who would not have remembered her name a week later. She thought about her father, and the debt he had never lived to see repaid. She thought about her mother, warm and safe and cared for, and slipping gently away in a room full of afternoon light. She thought about the still room in her chest, the one her father had built, and how it had gone quiet the first time Rafael Moretti had truly looked at her across the head table at the Ashcroft. "I saw them raise the gun," she said. "I had almost half a second to run the other way. I did not." "Why?" he said. His voice was very careful. "Because some part of me already knew," she said. He did not ask what. He reached for her hand, the one with the ring, and he lifted it to his lips, and he held it there for a long moment while the Atlantic moved below them, and the April wind pulled at her hair. She had spent 29 years being told she was too much. It had taken a bullet and a diamond and a man who had killed for less to finally teach her that she had never been too much. She had only been surrounded, her whole life, by people too small to hold her. If this story moved something in you, do not let it end here. Hit that like button so more women see it. Drop a comment below and tell me, honestly, would you have taken the bullet? Or would you have walked out the service door? I read every single comment, and the answers on stories like this one are always the ones that stay with me. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because next week I am telling the story of the plain librarian who accidentally married the Russian Bravo boss, and after that, the story of the plus-size ER nurse who saved a dying billionaire and inherited his empire. You do not want to miss what is coming. And remember this, wherever you are watching from tonight, the quietest women in the room are almost never the weakest. They are usually just waiting to see who is worth standing up for. Sometimes, when they finally move, the whole world moves with them.